I was going to spend some time discussing all the horrendous impacts that Brexit has had on our economy, but I thought, well, I don't want to look backwards for one thing, and for another thing, I don't want to depress you. But then I thought, well, I'll talk a little bit about what's happening now, and to be honest, that's not that cheerful either. And when I thought about this, it's rarely you're in a situation where things are moving quite so fast, so I hope what I'm going to say hasn't changed too much since I made the slide yesterday, or indeed since I left home earlier this afternoon, but who knows, we will find out as we go through. Yesterday I was having a cup of tea with a friend and I said, we must put on the headlines at 4 o'clock because that's when the US markets will open and we'll see what's happening. And at that point, Trump's backtracking, it's all going to be okay, we're not going to have those tariffs. But by the time I got home for the 5 o'clock headlines, oh no, that was a false rumour. So I'm afraid that is the world we're living in. It's pretty unpredictable. And Dominic's going to talk about opportunities, he tells me. I'm going to be probably a little bit more gloomy. But I've got to say that what I decided to focus on in the end is the two things. Well, one thing is the tariffs, which I have to say I do find it fascinating. I've always found the international trading system fascinating. I'm not particularly pro or anti, it's a little bit like a chess game to me. I do enjoy thinking about it. And the other aspect is more about the real serious threats we've got to our democracy, both in this country and in the US. Since I didn't have any power myself, really regret that, it's great having a little bit of power, I've really focused on making sure that the Green Party has good representation in Parliament. So I've been working behind the scenes, getting our 4 MPs elected in the summer. And since then, I'm focusing now on threats to the rule of law and democracy. So if I stray a little bit that way, you'll understand why that's the case. And actually, why I think that Brexit and us leaving the European Union was deliberately designed as a blow against our democracy. And we can see the forces now in this country who are standing in these elections actually with the Reform Party and Nigel Farage. They are absolutely not committed to democracy, and they have really got headway, as in the US, through the sort of narrative that was constructed during the Brexit referendum. So, everything has changed. You see, I put Trump in the bit where you can't really see him, just sort of faded him out a little bit there. Yeah. Has everything changed? I think everything has changed in the sense that during my time in politics, and yes, it has been 35 years, there were all sorts of assumptions that we just held without even questioning them. For example, the fact that you respect your opponents in politics. I mean, I've sat on platforms with Labour and Conservatives and Lib Dems, and you assumed that some people voted for them, and if you disrespected the politician, you disrespected the people who voted for them, and it just didn't happen. And that's something that changed with the Brexit referendum, and we've also seen that changing with Trump and his approach to politics in the US. Divisiveness, and not just divisiveness, but offensiveness to your political opponents. And this is a very key indicator of the far right on the rise and the undermining of democracy. I'm going to talk a bit more about tariffs later, but I want to be clear that I see the Trump regime as essentially a fascist regime. I said I would try not to use the F word, but I think, it's pussyfooting around saying populism and far right. I think it's fascism. I think we have a fascist president in the United States, and I think that's incredibly threatening to us all. So, to me, it's very problematic that then our government says, we'll try and bridge to that. I don't want us bridging halfway to that, and I don't want a pragmatic agreement over trade. I can understand why there's a concern that we don't add to the trade war, but it's not something I feel we should be accommodating to. And as we'll see later, the European Union has taken quite a distinctive position, and I think a much more positive position. So we were hearing all this talk about a bridge across the Atlantic. I think that's sort of faded a little bit now. But I believe we will have to choose between the US and the EU. And again, this is something which Labour is incredibly, and I think surprisingly, reluctant to do. We know that Brexit has had a devastating impact on our economy. 4%, the focus is growth, and yet 4% of our economy has disappeared. If we could improve our relationship with the EU, even if we rejoined the EU, that would immediately guarantee a lot of growth. So why are Starmer and Rachel Reeves so opposed to that? I do find it quite hard to answer that question. I think they've been very damaged by losing some seats in the northeast, and that's sort of an obsession with them now, and they can't see past that to take a more rational view about our position, about our relationship really with Europe, and the way that will be such an economic bonus to rejoin. But more importantly, perhaps, what is the point of trying to have a strong relationship with the US? It's much less significant to us in economic terms, but also Trump is just so totally unreliable. Dominic's going to talk more about the defence and security angle, and you can see from that point of view how Trump is utterly unreliable, but he's also very unreliable as an economic partner. I mean, he renegotiated the deal with Mexico and Canada during his first term. He's now just effectively thrown that away and starting to bully them into an even better deal. So why would you choose that relationship compared to a relationship with the EU, which is a rules-based system with partners you can trust? To me, that's misguided and actually pretty incomprehensible. And I think we have to remember all the time that when the Brexit debate was happening, when the referendum was on, Trump was very clearly supporting Brexit, and in a way that was a sort of practice run for what happened with his first term in the presidency. And Putin similarly was a big supporter of Brexit, and this is not a coincidence because the EU was about democracy and the rule of law. These guys are authoritarians and strongmen, and those two things run counter to each other, and if that's the choice, I know very clearly which side I want to be on. Yeah, I just wanted to share, a couple of headlines. Because people forget this. People forget how much Trump was trying to support Brexit, and also that Putin was clearly on that side and was, saw that as a way of stirring up division in this country and undermining our democracy, which is of interest to both of them. So let's compare the approach taken by Starmer with the approach taken by the European Union. Now, you may have heard there was a very good speech given by Robert Habeck. He's my political pin-up of the moment. He's a Green politician in Germany who's their economy minister, and he was speaking at the meeting they held in Luxembourg yesterday, and he was very strongly taking the position that we have to stand up against this kind of bullying. And the position they were espousing was this retaliate to negotiate. It's essentially, standing tough and then agreeing a deal later on, taking a pragmatic position. Now, nobody thinks it's good to have tariffs or to retaliate against tariffs, but to me the choice is giving in to economic coercion or standing up for yourself. And I think what's rather sad, although quite predictable, is the fact that the UK just doesn't feel strong enough to stand up for ourselves. The European Union does, because they're a strong, powerful trading bloc. But the UK is now, I'm afraid, quite a small economy and quite isolated in the world. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm not, patriotism is not top of the reasons I got into politics, but I absolutely felt that leaving the European Union left us weaker as a country, and it undermined our standing in the world. And I think we're seeing that very clearly. I mean, you can go out and say, brilliant, our tariffs are only 10%, but that's essentially because Trump doesn't see us as an opponent, I'm sorry to say. Why has he put 20% on the EU? Because he really does see them as an opponent. And they are rising to the challenge. So they have labelled what Trump is doing economic coercion. I think we can see that's the case, because it's not just, apart from the absolute nonsense of those numbers that he revealed on his table, it was embarrassingly bad. If a student submitted that to you, you would fail them. It was meaningless nonsense. But aside from that, it's the fact that he's putting pressure on us to change our domestic policy. He's not respecting democratic norms. So, he requires things of us that should not be required from one state to another, and that's why I think it's correct that the EU labels this economic coercion. And they have developed in Trump's first term, actually, here's one I prepared earlier, they got ready something called the anti-coercion instrument, which they can use to protect themselves. So moving beyond really the standard trade rules and saying if we come under economic coercion, we can protect ourselves. This is actually, I think, one of the sides where things have changed since I put these sides together, because it seems to me what happened in the meeting yesterday, although this didn't come out terribly publicly, was that some of the countries within the EU didn't want to take this position, and I suppose we would suspect that might be Hungary and Italy, and maybe we can think of a few others. So one of the weaknesses in a way of the European Union is everybody has to agree before you can move forward together. So it felt to me there was a little bit of weakening of this position, but nothing like the sort of kowtowing, as I would see it, the approach that Starmer's taking. Anyway, if you disagree with that, I realise I'm quite safe being rude about Labour in Salisbury, but if you want to disagree, please disagree when we get to the questions. Not like in Stroud, for example. So another issue, poor old Northern Ireland. I mean, as you said, I represented Gibraltar. Gibraltar was totally ignored. 96% stay in the European Union in the referendum, but they were just considered irrelevant as the discussions went forward. They were not. It's had more impact on them, probably, on the small number of people who live there than in any other part. But second impact has definitely been Northern Ireland. And here again, Northern Ireland are in real trouble because they're in the single market and not in the single market. So will they have to face tariffs of 20% or 10%? What about goods that move across that Irish border? Obviously Trump hasn't considered this, but also it's always been anomalous with Northern Ireland and it's always been problematic for them, and that's something that just wasn't taken into account when this decision was made to leave the EU. So I'm strongly supportive of the position the Greens are taking in Europe, and I hope that that the European Union as a whole can hang tough here, because China is being very aggressive. I don't think the EU wants to do that, but we do need people in the world to stand up to Trump. I think it's completely wrong to just allow him to be a bully or engage in coercion, and for other people just to fearfully go along with that. But having said that, it goes without saying that my party is all about peacemaking, as indeed was Edward Heath, and as indeed is the purpose of the project of the European Union. And trade wars, why did we set up an international organisation to stop trade wars happening? Because it was observed in the 1930s that trade wars led to real wars. And so, it's not just about the tariffs, it's not just about the economic damage, it's about the way that conflict over trade does lead to other types of conflict. And so, I don't think it's great to retaliate and to be as aggressive in return, but I don't think we should just give way to coercion. So, here's Jonathan Reynolds. I mean, it's a tough job, I give him that, it's a tough job. He was trying to negotiate, Labour's still saying they're going to get a deal with the US, but the purpose of the original negotiation was to get a special deal for steel, and that failed. We got the standard rest of the world 10% tariff. And even if that had succeeded, as I've already said, I think it's undignified and demeaning. I mean, perhaps those aren't important political objectives, but to me they are important. I want to see my country looking strong and feeling proud. And I'm sorry, but just sort of going off and cutting a side deal in the White House is not that. And I think it demeans our country. But it also demonstrates our weakness, and it enables Trump to follow through on this divide and conquer policy. That's why I'm appreciating what the EU's doing, but more important than that is the call from Mark Carney to say, look, the US is one country, we're the rest of the world. Why don't we get together and stick to a rules-based system and negotiate that between ourselves? I mean, I hope that's going to work. That, to me, is the completely obvious way forward. Trump is using his power, and the power of the US economy and the power of the dollar is a formidable power. But at the same time, the rest of the world is much larger and more powerful if united. And we're still committed to a trade system that's based on rules, as we are on democratic values and standards, I hope. And so those countries need to work together. So I would really hope that Starmer is going to move in that direction, closer to the EU, but also working with countries like Canada and Japan, who will return to a rules-based system. We've all heard that some things we might hold quite dear are on the table in these negotiations. The digital services tax, it took us a long time, and that was something I was involved in myself, to make sure that US corporations actually pay tax on the money they make in this country. The digital service tax was a small step in that direction, but that's now apparently something that might be negotiated away. Food standards, I mean, gosh, nobody wants to eat American food. It's absolutely appalling quality food, I think we're all aware of that. But that might be foisted on us. Of course, apart from whether you want to eat that yourself, it's the real damage that will do to our farmers. And you can hear from my resume that I was very much committed to supporting British farming, and I still am, and I don't want to see the good quality food produced here undercut by crap, to be honest, imports from the US. And then there's also the fact that the US corporations want into NHS data, and again, that's something which, anyway, I won't go into the detail of that, but that's long been a target for them. And I don't think we want our health data being used by US corporations, not to mention this intervention on domestic policy. I'm using the example of the abortion clinic here, but all that pressure around free speech, which is not free speech, it's saying what they want to be said and not saying things they don't want to be said. And again, that's an absolutely fundamental threat to democracy here. So, what's the way ahead? Well, as I've said, I think it's clear that what we should be doing is cooperating with those who still support a rules-based system, working together to rebuild the WTO, and if necessary, if the US can't still live up to this rules-based system, then just leave them outside. Although, of course, all these systems, this is the totally ironic thing, all these systems and structures were set up by the US at the end of the Second World War and have served the US. They did set them up, whether we're talking about the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund or General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades that morphed into the WTO. that was a system set up by the US and has served their purposes very well. So all rhetorical nonsense about the damage done to the US just doesn't appreciate the US's power over those decades and the fact that the systems work well for them. As I said, I think we should pick the European side, and it's been the Green policy for quite a long time that we should join the customs union, and that's also the policy of the European movement. More discussion around the single market. I was going to ask Dominic whether he thinks we should join the single market. I've got a real problem with joining the single market because that's following laws that we don't have representatives making. But anyway, that is the European movement's position. I've lost that argument. But certainly the customs union, you know, it's a way of benefiting from being part of the EU trading bloc. What would we lose? Well, we'd lose those trade deals with the Pitcairn Islands, or did we ever get a trade deal with the Heard Islands? I can't remember. Those tiny little trade deals that really were just for show and didn't benefit us at all. But what we would gain is being part of that strong trading bloc. Unity is strength. I think I made that point. So I just wanted to say a little bit about my view of globalization, so I don't come across as somebody who's sort of like completely pro the globalization that's happened in recent decades. This is a book I wrote shortly before I was elected. It actually suddenly seems very relevant. Adrian Ramsey, co-leader of the Green Party, was on the Today programme this morning, and Nick Robinson was asking him all sorts of questions. I thought, oh God, yeah, I think I wrote a book about that about 25 years ago or something. Because Greens have always challenged really the way globalisation is causing inequality and reducing the quality of jobs in this country. That was one of our original critiques of it. And it was quite amusing. I had a chat with Caroline Lucas, because she was a huge critic of Pascal Lamy, who used to be in charge of the World Trade Organization, and I think was also EU Trade Commissioner. And they were always having set twos about the benefits or otherwise of globalization. And then he appeared on the radio sort of saying how, basically what I said about how we need to cooperate on a rules-based trade system. I said, it's surprising how much I agree with Pascal Lamy these days. But anyway, I think that's absolutely right. It's about what those rules are that we're really disagreeing about. And as a Green, I've been a critic of globalization because I think there's been economic injustice created by the global trade system. And also, it's a question of identity, undermining our identity as employees. Essentially, the deal was, you get, as a consumer, you get cheap goods, but as a producer, you will have poor quality jobs, and a lot of the jobs that gave people a sense of identity and value disappeared as a result of that system. And that was never debated. It wasn't discussed, oh, well, you can have a meaningless job sitting at a computer, you won't be in manufacturing anymore, but you'll be able to buy a lot of cheap stuff. That was not put down and debated with people, it was just assumed. I'm talking about like 2000 or 25 years ago now, when globalization really started taking off. And I think it's the consequence of that that's really coming back to bite us now, whether we think about blue-collar workers in the US choosing to vote for Trump, or whether we think about people here choosing to vote Reform. That's the sort of sense of betrayal and injustice that's giving rise to those, what I think are anti-democratic movements. Also, of course, there's an awful lot of movement associated with this trading system, and that has a big environmental impact. And so as Greens, we were concerned about the pointlessness of the moving. I actually checked what do we export to the US and what do they export to us. And it's like 2.7 billion aeronautical, 2.2 billion. You're kind of thinking, maybe you could just make that in your own country rather than swapping. There's this idea of a great food swap, but there's all sorts of swaps that take place that seem to have a large environmental impact for no real benefit, at least no real benefit to citizens. Globalisation did, I've got the elephant graph, one graph, I'm sorry, you can take the professor out of the university, but you can't take the university out of the professor, so I'll just show you my elephant graph. So, this is showing you who's actually benefited from globalisation. The data's a bit old now, it's done by Branko Milanovic of the World Bank. And if you look across the horizontal axis there, it's showing you in 10%, each one is 10%, an income decile effectively. So the left is the poorest 10% of people in the whole world, and the right is the richest 10% of people in the whole world. So you can see that the very poorest did benefit, but not that much. But as you went up, so we're talking about people in India now, those lower deciles are middle-class people in India. They did, through globalisation, become better off. So some people on my side of the debate will say rhetorically, globalisation has made people poorer. That's just wrong. You can see here, it hasn't made people poorer. But the people it's made poorer are us, unfortunately, because if you look where the elephant's trunk comes down, that's kind of us, at 80-90% decile on a global basis, right? Not the richest people in the world, but the nearly richest people in the world. That's people like me, actually. And our incomes have been suppressed. And a lot of working class people in this country as well. So We've been the losers from globalisation, and this again is one of the reasons there's been resentment against this as an economic development. And then if you look where the trend is going up, that's obviously the super rich, and they've done incredibly well out of globalisation. So globalisation has brought economic growth, but the economic growth hasn't been shared equally. That's what this graph shows you, apart from being quite handily shaped like an elephant, which does make it more entertaining for students and perhaps for you as well. So, you know, the economic advantage that this has brought us, especially in terms of cheap consumer goods, you know, cheap clothes, cheap tech, that's been quite an incredible bonus, which we shouldn't set at no value at all. But it hasn't been worth the loss of identity and power that a lot of people have felt as their work, you know, their sense of pride in their work has been undermined. And I think a lot of what we're seeing now is the consequence of that. But and we've also seen a reduction in the power of unions, and because corporations have just been able to offshore work to places where people are not unionised and don't have good labour standards and so on. So anyway, I think it's important to say, I want to be fair about globalisation, but I can see, and I could see, I do remember writing this 25 years ago, that the consequence of this trade-off would be lack of identity and disgruntlement amongst working class people, and I think we're very much seeing that coming home to roost. So what are we going to do? Well, as I said, this is where I'm spending most of my effort. I'm actually writing a book, and it's called Resisting Fascism, A Citizen's Handbook. It's full of practical tips. It's quite entertaining, I promise you. It's not as gloomy as it sounds. Actually, in 2017, I did a roadshow, anti-fascism roadshow, when I first saw what was going on during the Brexit vote. And we had meetings all across the southwest. We didn't have one in Salisbury. We did have one in Swindon. And people came to those meetings, and it was advertised as like anti-fascism. And I invited politicians from different parties because I think it's crucial that we do cooperate as Democrats. But everybody left saying, that was really great. You know, so how could that possibly be that was really great? Because we just spent an hour and a half talking about fascism. But I think the point is understanding what you're up against actually makes you feel a lot better. My staff were freaked out by what was going on, and we spent some time analysing what did we mean by the far right and by fascism, what were we looking for, and how do we counter it. And so we're trying to turn that into a book now with all sorts of practical advice and tips. I mean, you know, join a society, don't spend all your time on your own. That really applies to young people who are so isolated, and you know, that lack of social contact is really allowing them to fall prey to these nasty ideologies. But it's also really important that we learn to disagree. And I think this is something that the combination of COVID and social media has left a lot of people in a situation where they're quite fearful of disagreeing with other people. The disagreement is the point. If we didn't disagree, you know, we wouldn't need democracy, would we? We'd just have technocrats running everything. But it is actually quite difficult. And so I think, you know, you need to practice that and get to that point where you, I mean, I know this happens to me. It's like, oh, I'm going to disagree with you, but you know, I'm going to have to do that in a polite way, but don't duck the disagreement. The disagreement's actually really important. But also, I think we need to engage citizens more in the way democracy works. People have a lot more leisure time now. They're also a lot better educated than they were when this particular system of democracy was set up. So that's why I suggest something like citizens' assemblies, giving people a way to engage in politics that's beyond just voting once every 5 years. People feel disconnected and that their politicians aren't listening to them, but yeah, I think there are lots of ways we could actually engage, we could actually get citizens solving problems. We've got a lot of intelligent people with time to spare who could help us, a bit like jury service really, help us sort out some of these problems. This is obviously only going to work if their deliberations are taken seriously. You know, otherwise it's like one of those fake consultations and people will end up even more pissed off at the end of it. Said I wouldn't swear. I got nearly to the end without doing it, apologies. But yes, I think, you know, engaging citizens more is part of what we have to do. Obviously, there's a lot of changes I would make to the way our democracy does work as well. But this idea of embracing the other is really important. I mean, I've always enjoyed, I'm really glad, obviously, I'm not sure Dominic really counts as other, but obviously he has been a Conservative, so perhaps he can. But I very much, you know, enjoy sharing platforms with people I don't agree with. You know, that's the whole point of democracy, isn't it? And I think every time you see that not happening, you can intervene. You know, if you're at a hustings and somebody's really offensive to somebody from another party, absolutely down to you to intervene and say, you know, you need to treat that person with respect. All of these things are crucial to upholding our democratic values. And my daughter lives in Scotland now, and she says in Scotland they have this thing called a participatory democracy certificate, which is like a way of engaging young people, but also older people. You can, you know, get engaged and learn ways to become an effective democratic citizen. I think we all have to think, well, I'm not asking you to get up every morning and, you know, over your porridge think, am I an effective democratic citizen? But My last slide coming now, don't worry. But yeah, I think we can't take democracy for granted at the moment. So we do all have to contribute in building it and strengthening it. And my last slide is actually a very European slide, and I think a picture that Edward Heath would like. I think I can take that liberty in saying that. I actually saw this photo, I think for the first time, in the Parliamentarium in Brussels. So that you've got the European Parliament, you've got this big forecourt, and opposite you've got the Parliamentarium, which is effectively a museum celebrating democracy, which I think is a wonderful thing. I think, you know, every country should have at least one of those. And I'm terrible. I mean, I go in there, went in with my daughter, I was in tears straight away. Oh God, Mum, you know, come on. But anyway, obviously I do care about democracy. But this was the real tearjerker moment for me. And I don't know if you remember this. I can't remember exactly when it was. I think I've got a note here that tells me. But, you know, they are commemorating the unknown soldier from the Second World War. And at some point, Mitterrand, who did fight in the war, Cole was too young to fight in the war, at some point Mitterrand sort of shot his hand out and grabbed Cole's hand. And I think this image of, you know, the two guys, France and Germany, who've been enemies, and also somehow because Mitterrand's such a little guy and Cole's such a big guy, I think there's something really intensely moving about this. And to me, this symbolises what the European project is about. If you work in the European institutions, you absolutely get immediately that France and Germany are the core of that, and they are holding Europe together in peace. And that, to me, is the value that I see being undermined now, and what I value so much about the European Union. So that's really why I joined the European movement and why I work with the European movement, and why I'm convinced that we not only should be members of the European Union, but we will be members of the European Union. Again, thank you very much.